Well, everybody, it's true. We're back. Fantasy Author's Handbook is here. I'm Phil. You can't see me because we are at the table in bad need of refinishing to talk about book number 27 in the 100 Book Challenge. Here we go. You see the cover. Let's do this thing. This is Howl, original draft facsimile, transcript, and variant versions, fully annotated by the author, Allen Ginsberg, with contemporaneous correspondence, account of first public reading, legal skirmishes, precursor texts, and bibliography edited by Barry Miles. That's a mouthful. This is the original hardcover first edition, but there does appear to be a paperback edition of this that you can just is in print and you can just get, and I absolutely recommend that you do so. Okay, so believe it or not, I'm like in my spare time a poet. I've been publishing poetry, writing and having my poetry published for coming up on 40 years. And poetry has always been this sort of side love of mine. My career was really built around fantasy, obviously, and game-related or D&D, tie-in fantasy, etc. And I still work primarily as an editor in fantasy, a genre that I have always and will always love. But poetry also has a huge part of my existence and sort of my, writing life. Allen Ginsberg, obviously one of the most important poets of the second half of the 20th century, right in there in the Beat generation, that small group of authors, and it was really a fairly small group of authors who were friends, collaborators, sometimes frenemies, which is a word that they would probably really hate. So that was Allen Ginsberg, obviously, sort of the weird, insane, drug-addicted father figure was William S. Burroughs, Kerouac, etc. So let's take a look at this book in a very simple blue. There's the man himself, separated by years, right? 1956, the first publication of Howl, and 1986, the publication of this book. 30 years on, right? So this is the hardcover presentation here, $22.50. A young Phil parted with that gleefully. It's very nicely put together. And I'm just going to flip through this. I don't have a prepared script. And I don't need one. It doesn't matter. We're just talking about a book that I read that I really liked. So let's do it. Have you not ever read the poem Howl? It is, I think it's really widely considered to be one of those turning point works of art where there was poetry, certainly American poetry, up to the point where Howl was first read and then published by City Lights in San Francisco. Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the proprietor, publisher, also poet, playwright, etc. So there was American poetry up to that point, and then Howl blew the lid off of everything, and it was an entirely different universe after that. This was the Beat generation poem. Right? If, the novels really were On the Road on one side and Naked Lunch on the other, which was sort of On the Road was how completely human can you become, right? Just I'm just a human out here in the world expressing myself in the most concrete terms. And I'm talking about life in the world right now, as opposed to Naked Lunch, which was this drug-fueled insanity, this, surrealistic thing that just challenged everyone's conception of literature. Howl did the same thing for poetry. And I love this edition here where we're seeing stuff like, this is Allen Ginsberg's little apartment where he wrote Howl, right? And so obviously this was, it says edited by Barry Mills, this was put together with full participation from the author. So Allen Ginsberg is writing all sorts of stuff all over this, right? Beginning with this author's preface and reader's guide. There's actually quite a lot going on here, right? And then, let's just actually see. So this is Howl, the Final Text, 1986. And this, one thing I learned from this book that I really didn't know. I read Howl for the first time X number of decades ago. I have no idea, but a long time ago. And I always got this feeling, certainly also from reading William S. Burroughs and Kerouac, who were basically just like, I'm just like exploding words onto the page, and there they are. Shazam, right? And including in this book, actually, Kerouac talks to Ginsberg about, revising this thing and basically telling him, don't. Once you start revising stuff, you ruin it. I'm a semi-believer in that, yeah? I do believe that the first sort of creative explosion is where 99% of the magic is. The other remaining 100% is cleanup so that other people can read and understand it, yeah? But Ginsberg worked on Howl. He made multiple drafts, including apparently all the way up to 1986 in the publication of this book 30 years later. So the book begins, I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can go out and find the text for Howl all over the place. Please do so if you haven't read this. You will probably recognize sort of snippets in here that have been repeated over and over again, right? This famous first line, which I'm going to tilt up a little bit so I can read. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Right? I mean, that was... Now, remember, okay, in 1986, this was like, he's like, it's kind of a punk song, like every punk song pretty much sounded like that. It sounded like that because Allen Ginsberg got there first. This was 1956. Okay, this is Leave It to Beaver America. This is President Eisenhower, right? This is the post-war conservative, we did it, we're the winners. Now, the women who went to work for the war effort, you're done working, go home, be June Cleaver, right? And in the middle of this, as open as he could be in 1956, when you could be arrested for being gay, when absolutely you were going to get fired, and if anybody asked why you got fired, your boss would say, well, we don't hire queers, right? They would use the shorter F word, probably. It was just absolutely no, right? So he's out there kind of probably in and out of the closet, depending on who he's talking to, and trying to be a poet. His father was a fairly well-respected poet. He was sort of being mentored by William Carlos Williams, who is mentioned and quoted throughout this. And, it's how do you get published and all that kind of stuff. He's in San Francisco, which was on the opposite coast of where all of the sort of literati are, the publishing and academic world of poetry in particular, out of the East Coast, New England, Ivy League stuff. And he's way over in San Francisco, which was already, really just kind of super weird frontier city. And he starts writing this stuff and made the decision at some point just in his head to decide, I'm not going to just be part of this sanitized, conservative, leave it to Beaver universe anymore. And he just started writing. And what he came up with was just this, howl is the only word for it, right? This is sort of scream from out of the cage of, just the existence of an artist, of a gay man, of somebody who just doesn't want to create product, right? Especially in that very limited scope that was allowed for anything, maybe even especially poetry, but novels and, the nascent TV, which was in its very early stages and was just as sanitized as possible. Movies were still operating under the Hays Code and so on. So this is 1956, where this guy is using whatever word he wants, including bad words, right? He's talking about what moves him, inspired by Carl Solomon, and you'll see here, Howl for Carl Solomon is the actual title of the poem, who he knew and who had been spending time in psychiatric institutions where he was undergoing, electroshock therapy and insulin-induced comas and all sorts of just that crazy proto-experimental psychiatry. And Ginsberg was suffering for him and trying to channel something about him. And what's interesting in this book is that he gets into, sort of really in this section, that he never expected this to be anything, because how could it be? Nobody's going to publish this. It's all full of swear words and references to, gay sex and things that are just never in a million years going to be published in 1956. And it turns out then he met this guy, Ferlinghetti, who owned a little bookstore in San Francisco and shared his I don't give a you-know-what about what the literati says or what the censorship board or such a thing thought about anything. I love this. This is pure expression. This is somebody talking about the real life of right now for people in urban environments who were there, who were broke, who were unemployed, who were gay, who were trans, who were not white, who were, addicted, who were just struggled in all of these different ways that Americans were struggling, that Americans struggle with now, that Americans struggle with in 1956, in 1936, in 1906, right? But he felt like, I'm going to howl for my friend Carl Solomon and himself, right? Ginsberg himself. So here we go. So that was it, right? This is the actual poem itself. It's longer for a poem, right? Very long lines, which he talks about being inspired by Whitman for in the longer lines, right? So it's that. The first, what am I doing? Maybe 6 or 7 pages, right? 7, 8 pages. Footnotes in the end there, which is actually sort of a part of the poem that was added later. It's in multiple parts. And it's just this wild scream from a very young author, and again, very marginalized author, who was not expecting anyone to necessarily read it, except like this small circle of friends who were getting it. Kerouac was already Kerouac, Burroughs was already Burroughs, etc., right? So that's it, right? So I've now read the poem, and all of the rest of this book is supplementary material, supporting material that is actually enormously fascinating. Here is something that may be completely dead now, right? Unless, and as an editor, because I've been burned by, hard drive failures and stuff like that in the past, I have version control over everything. At least once a day, that is a separate file with a date on it. So I have, Word files of manuscripts with all the changes tracked, right? Which is now the 21st century digital version of what you're seeing here, right? I think for a lot of authors, that stuff doesn't necessarily get saved. And no author has ever asked me for any of those, wants them for any reason, I don't think. There's really no reason for you to see, well, here's like the first 3 chapters, and then here's chapters 3, 1 through 10, or what, It doesn't matter until you get to the very end. I just have those all for version control, and also just, whatever, right? Once bitten, twice shy on that kind of thing. Ginsberg didn't save all of these typewritten pages that he then, with a pencil or a pen, went and crossed out words, added things, moved stuff around, put brackets around things, right? And then the editor of the book then set it up in this way, which looks suspiciously like words track changes, which is, I don't think anything was that even a thing in 1986. I don't believe it was. But this is the poem sort of in its final 1956 version. And he had to, for the publication of this book, go back to friends that he had given pages to. Like, here, read this and let me know what you think. Or, we're friends, I'm going to give you this early draft of Howl just as a present. Or, right, individual pages went to different people. So this was all put back together, obviously photographed, right? You see even the little punch holes in the typing paper. Typewriter, yes, not a computer, obviously, in 1956. And, I'm going to flip through because I don't know, if you're just the tiniest bit a poet, if you are really in that stage in your writing where you're thinking, am I revising too much? How do I look at this? Am I nuts because I'm just crossing stuff out? Am I nuts because I'm doing, C, C, D, C, making these kind of corrections and annotations, really, not even annotations, but corrections, edits, revisions is exactly what this is. Am I nuts? Well, here I think this is one of the great American poets and one of the seminal American poems, and you can see him working through it. And to me, that just was enormously fascinating. And even for somebody you would think, oh, Phil, but isn't this kind of a busman's holiday as an editor? Now you're looking at somebody, revising. You're reading a book that looks like the project you're working on, but, 70 years in the past. No, right? Because, again, as an editor, mostly I'm working on fantasy, science fiction, horror, thriller, stuff like that, novels, the occasional short story, but almost entirely novels, not poetry. But I'm writing poetry, and I'm realizing, you know what? There is a method to the madness in terms of type like a crazy person, and you'll see him do this, right, as we go into later versions of the poem. And then what I called, write with ecstasy, edit, or revise with intent, right? Just blow it out there. Get it out of yourself. Make sure they're all darlings. And then go and don't kill your darlings. Save your darlings and kill the bad stuff, right? The worst writing advice of all time, by the way. Kill your darlings. More and more. And the book is really good about saying what was canceled, right? What are the things that he crossed out and what he added. And you can see these typescripts are just like, almost like a crazy man sense to it, right? All single spaced and just kind of, I'm just writing this thing and knowing that I'm the only one right now who's seeing that this is going to go up to here, or this is going to go up to there, and this is going to do that. I'm adding a whole new line to the end of that line. I mean, just crazy, right? So this is Howl Part 1, Draft 4. begins this, right? Howl for Carl Solomon. And you can see him now. I'm going to try to make this a little bit readable for, is an editor going to read this? Are my friends going to read this? Can I get William Carlos Williams to read this? We don't know. But someone eventually has to be able to read it, right? And yet still, again, because this isn't on this isn't on Word or anything like that. So this all has to be done physically because he lives in a physical analog world, yeah. He has typed this all out by hand and then with a pencil decides, no, you know what, this whole stanza would be better right here. And to me, again, fascinating. If you're not fascinated by now, you have turned this off. So welcome all you people fascinated by the way an author works through a manuscript. And what I think to me is the most significant, here's Howl Part 1, Draft 5, is this isn't just an author working through stuff. This is among the most important poets of the 20th century working through one of the most important poems of the 20th century, right? So do you love Allen Ginsberg or the Beats, whatever, or you don't? It doesn't matter. It's one of those things where everybody just has to understand that this was a big deal. And we're going to talk a little bit more about, the things that made this significant in its time and what is freakishly and in some cases sadly relevant now, coming up, 29 years later. Insane, right? And I read every word of this, by the way, because that's where my headspace is. This is, to me, it's sort of looking at what I do for a living in a different version, in a different way, in a different form, looking at authors, the author at work, the poet at work. And so, yeah, I read the poem over and over and over again in very different forms, right? I'm going to keep flipping through because these are just, again, it's one typescript, page after page after page. This is now we're at Howl Part 2, Draft 8. So again, it just goes on like this, right? And I know that a lot of you are like, oh my God, could you really just read this over and over again? And the answer is yes. Because it's not just, well, here's the poem and it's slightly different. It's seeing the stuff that he's cutting out. And in some cases, and they don't really say why, right? It's just this is what's added and then you can see stuff that's crossed out. But he isn't saying, I was afraid that would get me in trouble or I didn't like that word, right? It gets into more of that later, where a section of this book that we'll flip through quickly is essentially goes through all of these drafts line by line, and Ginsberg talks about exactly that, right? Why did I take that out? What made me sort of reconsider stuff? Things like how he got to this Moloch section that is sort of brings a sort of a religious sense, of almost religious fervor to the thing. And again, page after page after page after page. This is Howl Part 3, Draft 5. Right? Guide to the Original Manuscripts, Part 4. Yeah. And it just keeps going and going and going with more and more and more of these pages. And I know I'm going to start going faster here because I think the point has been made, that he worked feverishly on this. It mattered to every word mattered to him. The order of every stanza mattered to him. And he kept working on it until he felt like it was right. And anyway, up to the publication of this book in 1986. Here we've got, this is a section where we actually learn who, and for years and years, right, I didn't know really who Carl Solomon was. He was like the guy Allen Ginsberg wrote Howl for, right? But here we actually learn about who he was. Pictures of him. This is a reintroduction to Carl Solomon here in February of 86 by Allen Ginsberg himself, of course. And then Carl Solomon, who, it turns out, was not happy about this. He was not happy that this, certainly by 1956 standards, right, vulgar, screaming obscenities poem was written in his honor. He sort of felt like it was outing him as somebody who was struggling with mental illness. He himself was working as an editor, and it was kind of like, why are you dragging me into this? And he and Allen Ginsberg had a significant falling out based on that. And Ginsberg admits through this entire thing that he didn't think through that. He didn't think, again, because he wrote this poem figuring like Burroughs, and he would send it to his father and William Carlos Williams, Kerouac, right, Gregory Corso, a couple other people, friends, close circle of other poets, authors, etc., would read it, and they'd be like, yeah, Daddy, that was great, right? And that would be it. And instead, he sort of climbed onto this train that Lawrence Ferlinghetti was essentially the conductor of, and off it went. And all of a sudden, it was this nationwide sensation. And poor Carl Solomon is like, hey, man, really? Like, we met in a mental institution, and then you write this poem and mention my name, and it seems to be about me going insane and trying to pull my brain back together, and, all of the sort of inherent trauma of life that went into making me, as Allen Ginsberg believes, right? It wasn't like he sat down and interviewed Carl Solomon and said, hey, I want to write a poem about you. Is this right? How did you feel about that? He just was sort of thinking of his friend and howled out this thing. And Carl Solomon was like, yeah, man, maybe check with me right before you throw me, not under the bus, but kind of under the bus, right? Before you out me to a very high degree, yeah? Report from the Asylum, right? This is an essay by Carl Gay that really gets into, Carl Guy, who gets into what was going on in terms of the mental health care world in America in 56. And if you think it's bad now, and it is bad now, we need to do better as a country taking care of each other. Phil's political statement of the moment. And that's not political, it's human. What the hell? Anyway, this includes some writing by Carl Solomon himself. This is Allen Ginsberg, right? Oh, Carl, a dream. Essentially an apology. Hey, man, I did not think, one, that anyone was going to read this. Two, that I should maybe talk to you before it gets published, at least, right? If it's he gives a typescript copy to Kerouac and says, what do you think of this? And he's like, yeah, that's really cool. And it says Carl Solomon, no one cares. In a book that is actually published and then becomes extremely controversial, which then makes it extremely successful, right? So, authors, before you write the whatever for the person, talk to the person. If the person is dead, knock yourself out. Anyway, or, certainly if the person is a public figure. There's different rules. I'm not a lawyer. Don't take legal advice. But talk to people before you say, right, Howl for some friend of yours. Hey, if this gets published somewhere, are you going to be cool? Is that okay? And they might just go yeah, leave me out of it. And in which case, leave them out of it. And I don't know, to be honest with you, that would have affected Howl at all. If Ginsberg had showed it to Carl Solomon and he said, why is my name on this? I don't want my name on this. and he just took the name off, it would still be the poem. It would still be just as good, because people like me, born, almost a decade after the first publication of this poem, didn't know who Carl Solomon was, wasn't judging Carl Solomon in any way, was just blown away by this. I mean, when I first read it, right, punk rock Phil reading this thing going, wow, we're not inventing anything, right? The Sex Pistols invented nothing, right? This is all started from here, as far as I can tell. There are a few instances where you're seeing this before 1956, but wow, man. I mean, these were people who just finally said, all of this fake America is just exactly that. There's a dark underbelly, and it's right here, and it's not okay. Yeah. The author's annotations. This is so complicated. This is where I'm like, really? Allen Ginsberg, Beat Generation poet, starts getting mathematical about his stuff here. There he is in Berkeley. When was this? 1956. Photo by Peter Orlovsky. Why not, right? Your friends take pictures of you, don't they? So this is the final and first draft. So this is basically, as you go through here, you can go back and forth between early drafts and the final draft and see where these changes are. And then he talks about why those changes were made. I just, rather than doing all the flipping, I just read these as a list of anecdotes, essentially, right? Let me just grab some random here. Carl Solomon writes, I burned money while upset about the evils of materialism in 1956, prior to commitment to Pilgrim. That was the mental institution. Date may have been earlier. Howl, written in 1955. So it's just these little things that are not just, I deleted that word because it felt like it was kind of, it was out of place. It was a little bit too dry or something like that, whatever. It's really anecdotes about the life that he was leading around the writing of Howl. And, here's this, I love this movie marquee. The Wild One is like the craziest movie of all time, which if you see now is just sort of like, really? Stranger Wore Gun is probably a Western, right? Tarzan the Ape Man. Right. Love Edgar Rice Burroughs too, along with William S. Burroughs. I don't know. If I start reading these, it's going to become like this 5-hour audiobook weird thing that I don't have permission to do. So I'm just going to keep flipping through this. But you can see the wealth of information about the life around the writing of this poem, the people around the writing of this poem. Because Ginsberg really was a part of this community of writers and artists in San Francisco at the time, which is just... I know for them, it didn't feel like a golden age. Everybody was broke. Everybody was in the closet, kind of, most of the time, etc. People were trying to make a living. Ginsberg himself was in the Merchant Marines for a while. So was, I think, Kerouac, right? They were all just sort of traveling, trying to make a living, trying to just afford anything. William S. Burroughs had a trust fund because his grandfather invented the adding machine, but everybody else needed to make a living, And again, dealing with just the world around them, the country around them. The United States of America, 1956. Not the most welcoming place for anybody who wasn't. Yeah. So here's something that I actually took a picture of and copied out. And will this show up in a blog post? Maybe, right? It's something that I set aside in sort of my commonplace book file that is worth thinking about. This list of essentials, right? And should I read all these? I don't think I'm going to read all 30 of them, but just in general, right? This is the sort of thing that he This is actually Kerouac, right? Jack Kerouac, who sort of made this list a sort of manifesto. And it says the list was tacked on wall above author's bedstead in North Beach Hotel a year before Howl was written. Scribed secret notebooks and wild typewriters or typewritten pages for your own joy. Submissive to everything, open listening. Try never get drunk outside your own house. Be in love with your life. Something that you feel will find its own form. 6. Be crazy. Dumb saint of the mind. I'm going to get a t-shirt printed up. Be crazy, dumb saint of the mind. Blow as deep as you want to blow. Write what you want, bottomless from bottom of the mind. The unspeakable visions of the individual. This is the mindset of these guys, right? Again, really think about the world of America in 1956, and that these guys were operating at that level. Get this book for this list of 30 things for no other reason, right? It will remind you that, hey, there's an art to this. What about being an artist? Do I want to say that again? Because I work with a lot of authors who the first question they ask is this sellable? Will this sell? And the only honest answer I could really give to anybody, regardless of what you have written, it does not matter. These so-called tropes, that word is the worst thing in the world, right? Trends, etc. Like how healthy is the publishing industry at any given time? The publishing business has never been healthy ever. The fact that it seems like it's unhealthy now is exactly the same unhealthiness as 10 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Anyway, right? Is it going to sell? The only honest answer is no, because the overwhelming number, right? The overwhelming percentage of the times the books don't sell. They don't sell to a publisher, and when the publisher publishes them, they don't sell to people. Do it anyway, man. Do it anyway, right? For this list of 30 reasons and another 30 that you come up with in your desperate nights of the soul. This then goes into sort of the whole Moloch thing, right? What does that mean exactly? And I, again, just found all of this stuff fascinating as the author's process, but then also the author's memories, that the poem was not a thing separate from his life. It was not a thing separate from its time, its community, and so on. It was, and even again, 30 years later, he is thinking back and remembering these things, seeing, letters that he was writing back and forth. And then look at how much more there is to go still in the book, and we're at the appendices. At some point it kind of felt like this is the never-ending extreme deep dive into this one poem. But it really is also an extreme deep dive into Ginsberg's process, the community, the history about, the context in which the poem was written, was read, published, etc. And here we have these correspondences, right? Letters going back and forth between Ginsberg and Kerouac and Ginsberg and Williams, and some of it is really crazy. And to Ginsberg's credit, of course, by 1986, Howl was firmly entrenched as this great poem. So Ginsberg was past having to sort of defend himself or prove himself. And so you're really getting stuff like from William Carlos Williams saying like, man, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. This is so great. And then kind of coming around to the point where he actually wrote an introduction, and an introduction that Ginsberg didn't really necessarily like. So there's that kind of fun inside stuff that, where do these introductions come from? Are people, nobody is going to write an introduction to a book written by a guy who's kind of a protege, right? And say, yeah, I told him this was bad, and so buckle up because this poem is terrible. Instead, Williams tried to kind of wrap his head around it. To Ginsberg's mind, failed. So the introduction sort of says, this is kind of what this poem is trying to say, and Ginsberg's like, no, it's not. It's so, but again, that's art. You're done with this thing. You put this thing out there, and then everyone begins to misinterpret it, reinterpret it to their tastes, to their experience, etc. There's also a section in here which I just found hilarious and so cringeworthy when Howl got a really bad review. And Ginsberg wrote this unbelievably long reply to the critic about why he was wrong. And it was like, what the heck are you doing? Just note to all authors, respond in no way to any critics ever. Just never, ever do it. There's that way lies madness, especially in the social media landscape where, oh, you know, I pissed off this author and now that gets spread around through whoever. Oh, just no. Just not at all. Right. And here you can see that, you know, as the book is originally coming out, Ginsberg isn't even in San Francisco, right? Allen Ginsberg on board USNS Sergeant Jack J. Pendleton at sea to Lawrence Ferlinghetti in San Francisco. Right. So Ginsberg's like, meanwhile, I have to like go make a living crewing these ships. And he's getting letters back and forth from Ferlinghetti like, yeah, everything's going to be fine, right? This is going to be good. This is the response to the critic. Right? It's like, Al, don't do it, right? And then this was really interesting. The first, you know, sort of little articles about the first reading at the Sixth Gallery on October 7th of 1955. And it has this, I'm going to roll out there, this little typewritten kind of notice, the sort of little flyer that says, okay, some poets are going to be reading at this gallery. It's going to be like all the Hepcats are going to be there, man. And can you imagine? That's one of those things where it's like, go back in time and be at that reading. Oh my goodness, right? Just to be there. There it is. And this appendix to me too was sadly relevant. The fact that we are now living in this insanity, right? The complete psychological unraveling of the Republican Party that has now just that has turned loose the complete nitwits and crazies who are banning books, closing libraries, taking everything off the shelves, in some cases, literally everything. Anything that mentions that, you know, somebody has two mommies is now sexually explicit. Like, the you talking about, right? In 2025. And here in this book, we see in Appendix 3 all sorts of the legal history of Howl, because one of the booksellers at City Lights in San Francisco was arrested for selling whatever, pornography, dangerous material to minors or whatever, by selling that book over the counter that was published by Ferlinghetti from the bookstore's publishing wing, right? He's taken to court because he mentions that there are gay people and gay people do stuff. He is taken to court because he uses swear words. He's taken to court because some of these things kind of talk about body parts that we think are icky. And now it's happening again. 70 years later, when we are all supposed to be smarter and better people, it's happening again. And this is, oh my God. Footnotes to my arrest for, I mean, here's the bookseller who was arrested. Just, I mean, you gotta be kidding me, right? So meanwhile, while all of this is happening, Allen Ginsberg is not even in the country. He is getting letters, right? Remember, it's 1956. Nobody's texting each other, right? Nobody's getting emails. Letters mailed physically to a ship at sea. I think he's in Tangier for some period of this time while the trial was going on, a trial about a poem. We're going to sit for a minute and digest that there was a trial about a poem. In the United States of America. Okay, so I don't know. A part of me, though, really wants to read this excerpt from the decision from the judge that immediately gives you some faith in America in the same way that decisions are being made. Now, just recently, a court said all of the books that the Department of Defense took off the shelves in all of their schools and libraries go back on, period. There are still functioning, decent people who understand the Constitution and are not afraid of this jackass. And you know the jackass that I mean. Anyway, and all of his nitwit cronies. So here's what it really comes down to, right? The judge said, therefore, I conclude the book Howl and Other Poems does have some redeeming social importance, and I find the book is not obscene. The defendant is found not guilty, period. But in this decision, I wish a time would allow and my eyesight would allow just reading the entire thing. It's fairly long, but it really is a very conservative, right, very religious judge, fairly conservative anyway, actually being forced to do this, right? Read this weird poem that this guy wrote and let us know if you think that a person who sold it, who they cannot prove ever even read it, which was a key part of the defense, should go to jail for selling a poem. Are you kidding me? But this judge really worked through what it is, these sort of 12-part criteria for what should or should not be banned or considered obscene and everything. And he kind of goes through and says, checks none of those boxes. This is a work of art. If you don't like it, don't read it. Thank you. 1956, which is why I was able to read it, right, without going to France and finding some bootleg copy of it or whatever the hell. And then this is sort of the last appendix here. Ginsberg references certain poems and poets that inspired the writing of it. Obviously, he wasn't copying them in any way because some of these people were, right, here's Christopher Smart, right? I mean, these are poets from a very long time ago, right? Early 19th century and mid 19th century poets and so on. Right, Shelley. And I read every word of all of these poems and they were fantastic. But this is what I thought was really interesting too, right? Every page was fascinating. It really was. But Ginsberg was saying, I'm not pretending that I wrote this in a bottle. I did not invent poetry. He may have reinvented it, for sure, with this one crazy blast of different than everything else that came before it. But he is showing here by including the poems that he was reading up to the point where he wrote Howl and saying, there were precursors to this. I do not exist in a bubble. I am not the first poet in the world, right? And These are the poems that he was reading. And I just loved the sort of opposition that they were, but at the same time you can see, yeah, there's a tradition, there's a part of a tradition. And as authors, we all stand on each other's shoulders. We just do. And you can try as hard as you can to reinvent everything, and I hope that you do try to do that, because people who do that then move things forward. But we're all a part of this continuum, and we are all a part of this community. You are absolutely, as an author, influenced by the works of other authors that you have read. You are also influenced by the authors that those authors have read. So if I was influenced by Allen Ginsberg, and I absolutely was, then I was also influenced by all of these people, some of whom I've never read before. Yeah. So this book, I mean, to me, it's absolutely fascinating. How was this incredible thing, this scream from the streets, actually written? How did it get to the form that it is in, the form that it ended up being in 1986? And how is it positioned in history, right? And not is it in so many different ways. The obscenity trial, the first explosion of beat poetry in that one reading in San Francisco, just the history of all of that, the City Lights bookstore and City Lights Publishing, and just amazing work that went out into the world and flipped things. There was how we approach literature in America up to then, and then how we approach it afterwards. An absolutely huge influence on every artist that came after this, to some degree or another, right, was either directly influenced by reading by reading the work of Allen Ginsberg or William S. Burroughs, etc., or influenced by people who were influenced by Ginsberg, Shelley, Shakespeare, etc. Okay, everybody, that was Allen Ginsberg's Howl, the mega crazy 1986 super deep dive. This was book number 27 in the 100 book challenge. Oh, I'm going so slow. I've been so work busy, which is good, right? Really getting a lot of work done, working with, oh my God, such great books that I've been getting too. Like, there's such great stuff out there. Reading has really sort of fallen down. It's not good. I got to get going. If I'm going to finish this 100 book challenge anytime in the next, like 2 years, I got to start reading. This was fantastic. Howl, 100 book challenge number 27. I have been Phil. This has been Fantasy Author's Handbook. Go out there and howl, but check with the guy you're howling about before you include his name on it. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again soon.